Who is the real Jane Austen? A presentation by Andrea Johnston. Is the storyline of the popular movie Becoming Jane fact or fiction? Let's find out. Let me give you some background information about the movie. The movie is basically about Jane Austen in her late teens, possibly early 20s. It mainly focuses on her first love, Thomas Lefroy. In the movie, we find out that Jane is a writer and wants to marry for love and not income. She is even proposed to by Mr. Weasley, who could financially take care of her and provide her with a good life. But she does not love him and turns him down. This goes to show what kind of woman Jane really was. We are also introduced to many of Jane's family members, like Cassandra, her sister, Henry, her brother, her parents, Reverend George Austen and Mrs. Austen, her cousin Eliza, and her disabled brother George. Thomas Lefroy is a young lawyer who lives with his uncle in London. He solely depends on his uncle for an income. Lefroy doesn't have a good reputation and he spends his time ring fighting and partying. His uncle sends him to his other family, the Lefroys, who live, quote, in the country, unquote. For first impressions, Jane and Tom do not have a good one. They met at a neighbor's house where Jane was reading. Tom came in late and was bored out of his mind. Later on, Jane heard him describing her readings as, quote, juvenile, unquote, which only upset her. At that point, Jane made up her mind that she does not like him. The above picture is taken at a ball where Jane is realizing her feelings for Tom and is happy to see him, and has eyes only for him. Mr. Weasley is on the other side, watching her reaction to Lefroy. Although Mr. Weasley is described as a, quote, boob, unquote, by George Austen, her father, he is a likable character. At times, I wonder how the movie would have turned out if she just would have married him. Could she have eventually grown to love him? Mr. Weasley says a memorable quote when he asks her to marry him and she rejects him. Quote, "Sometimes affection is a shy flower that takes time to blossom," unquote. But obviously, Jane does not pick him. She picks Mr. Lefroy. The problem with picking Mr. Lefroy is that his uncle does not approve of him marrying a poor girl like Jane. And as I mentioned before, his uncle is his only source of income. Lefroy and Jane are apart for some time. During this time, Jane finds out Lefroy is engaged. When he comes back for a visit, Lefroy seeks Jane out and talks her into eloping. Jane eagerly agrees and they run away together. But Jane finds a letter in his pocket and finds out that he supports his parents and siblings with his uncle's income. She then explains that they could never be and leaves him. They meet again 20 years later, Jane being famous for her books, and he with his own teenage daughter named Jane, named after his first love. The movie ends there. Now that we know the background of the movie, Becoming Jane, the question of what is fact and what is fiction arises. The movie is obviously not a biography of Jane, but through research I found out that some aspects of the movie are true. Although not specified in the movie, the real Jane was born December 16, 1775. She has 7 siblings: Cassandra, Francis, James, George, Edward, Henry, and Charles. Jane was the baby of the family, her nickname being Jenny. In the movie, we see Jane spending time with George, her brother, who is mentally disabled. This part of the movie is a true fact. Jane, in fact, did have a disabled brother named George. According to the biography, quote, Jane Austen, A Life by Claire Tomlin, all of the Austen children were sent to a village nurse in Steventon Village until they were able to somewhat fend for themselves. George, quote, suffered from fits and failed to develop normally, unquote. Due to this reason, he was not able to come home and was sent away to be cared for by his Uncle Thomas. Jane conversed with him using sign language, as it shows in the movie. Cassandra. Cassandra Austen is a key player in Jane's life. According to Tomlin, when the girls are younger, Cassandra is to Jane a, quote, share of her bedroom and her secrets, and represented something she did not find in her ever active mother, unquote. As Jane and Cassandra grew older, preteen years, Cassandra was the one to give Jane help and advice about menstruation, how to deal with awkward and unpleasant situations like attracting admirers, and much more. She was also Jane's best friend. By the time they were young adults, Jane and Cassandra shared secrets as sisters do, asked each other's opinions, and were closer than ever. Their mom described in a letter to her sister, quote, if Cassandra's head had been going to be cut off, Jane would have cut hers off too, unquote. The movie did not insinuate the closeness between Jane and Cassandra, and frankly that was disappointing. Cassandra was indeed engaged to Tom Fowl. They named him Robert in the movie, and I'm still not sure why they did that. In 1795, he traveled to the West Indies to fight the French. Cassandra never saw him again. He got sick and never recovered. Cassandra's misery is clearly shown in the movie, and it surely was portrayed correctly as the real Cassandra would have felt and acted. Cassandra never married and was close to Jane the rest of her life. Cassandra died in March 1845. A great niece describes her as, quote, a pale, dark-eyed old lady with a high arched nose and a kind smile, dressed in a long cloak and a large drawn bonnet, both made of black satin, unquote. Eliza Ann Henry. When reading the biography, I noticed that most of Jane Austen's family is important to her. But the book seemed to mention not only Cassandra frequently, but her first cousin Eliza Hancock and her brother Henry. Eliza was 14 years older than Jane, but they became very attached to each other growing up. Eliza is described as a, quote, bird of bright plumage with a story that might have come from one of those romances Janes like to mock, unquote. Eliza married a French count and had a little boy named Hastings, who was disabled. When her husband died, Eliza returned to live in London, where she married Henry Austen. Throughout the movie, we see Henry and Eliza constantly at each other's sides, and Henry always seems to be borrowing money from her, which she willingly gives him. According to the biography, there is truth to this part of Eliza and Henry. Henry Austen is Jane's favorite brother. He is 10 years younger than Eliza. Tomlin writes that Henry, quote, had a turn for wit and flattery and knew how to tease, and Eliza enjoyed the teasing, especially since it was so evidently admiring, unquote. Eliza also died young, much like Jane. The book states it was due to breast cancer. Henry lived a full life and died in 1850. I feel that the couple portrayed as Eliza and Henry in the movie is what I expect the couple to act like in real life. Thomas Lefroy. Thomas Lefroy is mentioned in a letter written to Cassandra by Jane. Jane is 20 years old at the time. Mr. Lefroy is a visitor. According to Jane, he is a, quote, gentleman-like, good-looking, pleasant young man, unquote. Lefroy has completed a degree in Dublin and was about to study for the bar in London. Lefroy is dependent on his uncle's income, just like in the movie. Lefroy is Jane's, quote, Irish friend, unquote, whom she loves to dance with. Since Jane nor him had any sorts of income, marriage was out of the question. When his family noticed that the couple was falling in love, he was sent away. 3 years later, he married an heiress and became Lord Chief Justice of Ireland. Tomlin writes, quote, as a very old man, he acknowledged when questioned that he did indeed love Jane Austen in 1796, unquote. Although this experience was a short one for Jane, it was a painful one. Becoming Jane exaggerated what happened between Tom and Jane in the short period of time. Tom is briefly mentioned in the biography, but it did say that he did make an impact in Jane's life. Maybe it was because of him that she never married. We will never know. But it's really interesting. The real Jane was proposed to by Harris Bigg, not a Mr. Weasley, like the movie implied. Jane accepted his proposal and now would become the future mistress of a large Hampshire house in an estate called Manydown. But that night, Jane stressed and decided against it. In the morning, she told Harris and left. Jane never married. I truly do think that Thomas Lefroy was her one true love, and it saddens me to think that they couldn't be together, all because of money. And the rest, they say, is history. We all know the novels Jane wrote throughout her short life. I appropriately am showing Sense and Sensibility because it was her first published novel. Jane published 6 novels altogether and did become popular in her time. But it is wise to say that she is more popular now than she was back then. Some of her audience believes that her books are based on real people. For example, Sense and Sensibility may be somewhat about Jane and Cassandra. In my opinion, her characters are based on people around her and herself. Jane shows an independent mind and spirit in herself that reflects in her heroines. Jane is also admirable and real. Her audience can relate to her and her novels. She is a beloved, talented author, and I have loved researching her and reading her novels. All in all, Becoming Jane was an entertaining movie to watch, but for accuracy of Jane in her life, it wasn't very precise. Thank you for listening.